Left of the box. The CBC, or as I have fondly referred to them, the Corporations Before Canadians news network, is our national publicly funded news here in Canada. So much so, it's on the Wikipedia page that it's funded by the government. And Pierre Poilievre was just so upset about that when he learned that because apparently he didn't know how to do a wiki search. And the reality is, it's always been that way. It's always been government funded. And they've always had a bias. But it's not towards the liberals, as Pierre Poilievre was trying to say. It's always been towards the status quo. And I've talked about it plenty on my channel. Well, it turns out the CBC is completely biased coverage when it comes to the news. What? The Breach, a progressive news magazine. I don't know, what do you call them these days? News. They're not a network, but they're online. I don't think they actually have magazines. So The Breach, blog, podcast, whatever you want to call it. They're fairly new, and they have a lot of wonderful progressive people supporting them, reporting for them. Well, they did a deep dive into the CBC, and it turns out, yeah, we were all right. We all could see it. The biases that the CBC had when it came to the conflict over between Israel and Hamas. It's not the only way the CBC has been biased, but it's been particular egregious, let's just say, with what's been happening over there. And so the Breach did an in-depth investigation, and they released this article, and it's been ruffling some feathers. Good. Let's get into it. It's annoying when I make the screen so big people can see it. Their web pages are not formatted to be, what is this at? 200% zoom in. So, this is from May 16th, 2024. CBC has whitewashed Israel's crimes in Gaza. I saw it firsthand. Working for 5 years as a producer at the public broadcaster, I witnessed the double standard and discrimination in its coverage of Palestine and experienced directly how CBC disciplines those who speak out. And this is by Molly Schumann. Worked at the CBC and is now blowing the whistle on them. The executive producer peered at me with concern. It was November 16th, 2023, and I had been called into a virtual meeting at CBC. I was approaching my 6th year with the public broadcaster, where I worked as a producer in television and radio. He said he could tell I was passionate about what was happening in Gaza. His job, he told me, was to ensure my passion wasn't making me biased. He said I hadn't crossed the line yet, but I had to be careful. The conversation ended with him suggesting that I might want to go on a mental health leave. Ouch. Yeah. Can't blame people for getting passionate over a genocide that's happening. And if you start to acknowledge it, they call you crazy. Like, quite honestly, I feel like I have been going crazy witnessing what's been happening over there with so little pushback from other nations, from Canadians, from seeing Zionists freak out over the sight of a keffiyeh, all of that. I feel like I've been losing my mind because we see the genocide, we see the horror, and it feels like we're just screaming into a void sometimes, trying to get proper coverage on this, trying to get our governments to acknowledge what's happening, trying to do anything to just make it stop. I declined. My mind was fine. I could see clearly what was happening. Earlier that day, I had spoken out in a meeting with my team at CBC News Network, the broadcaster's 24-hour television news channel. It was the 6 weeks into Israel's siege and bombardment of the Gaza Strip, which had, at the time, killed over 11,000 Palestinians, the majority of them women and children. Legal experts were already suggesting that what was taking place could be a potential genocide, with Israeli Holocaust scholars calling it a textbook case. I expressed concern to my team about the frequency of the Palestinian guests getting canceled, the scrutiny brought to bear on their statements, and the pattern of double standards in our coverage. After this, I pitched a reasonable and balanced interview, two genocide scholars with opposing views, discussing whether Israel's actions and rhetoric fit the legal definition of the crime. Senior colleagues sounded panicked. My executive producer replied that we had to be careful not to push hosts into difficult positions. They wanted time to consult with higher ups before making a decision. A few hours later, I was sitting across from the same executive, being warned about crossing the line. Like, all of this is pretty much what I imagined was happening. Because all through this, it's like my frustration with CBC when I use a lot of their articles for my analysis in the news. It's not so much that they're lying, it's that they're only showing it from one perspective, one bias. And the instant that you want to have other opinions in there, they accuse you of being biased. But so many of the articles I was seeing from them was all about the attack on October 7th, the death toll from October 7th. And occasionally they would mention the death toll in Gaza, but neglect to mention how that death toll was happening. Neglected to mention, the 2,000-pound bombs being dropped. At one point it was counted over 200, and that was at the very early stages of this. The hospitals that were being, wiped off the map, but CBC would be like, but there was, probably Hamas in there, so that makes it okay. It's one of the things, like, it's great this person has come out and we have this article, but why did it need to come to this before people started calling out the CBC for what they were doing? Why did it have to take this long? Why weren't they listening to all the other people, the scholars, just the average people like me who could see quite plainly what was happening? But since we don't have any authority, we don't have any credentials, we're a bunch of nobodies, it doesn't matter. But, it took somebody from within the company to actually start speaking out before other places are like, Well, to be fair, The Breach has called out CBC before. I've called out CBC before. But this article in particular has been getting a lot of attention. Good. The following afternoon, I showed up for what was supposed to be a typical meeting to go over the interviews we had lined up for the coming days, but some unusual guests were present. In addition to my coworkers, the faces of my executive producer and his higher-ups appeared on Google Meet. The managers were there to talk about my pitch. They said they weren't vetoing it, they weren't meant to even make editorial decisions, but suggested our show wasn't the best venue. I pointed out that the network was deemed a suitable place for interviews with guests who characterized Russia's war on Ukraine and China's oppression of the Uyghurs as instances of genocide. The managers looked uncomfortable. I was reassigned to work on a panel with two guests calling the West to support a regime change in Moscow and Tehran. Ever since these unusual meetings had started, I was recording them for my protection. This person has receipts. Good. If journalists in Gaza were sacrificing their lives to tell their truth, I should at least be prepared to take some risks. But that wasn't the end of the blowback. The next week, late on Friday afternoon, I received an email from the same two managers who had poured cold water on my pitch. They needed to speak to me urgently over the phone. I was asked to keep the conversation secret. Okay, when a news organization starts doing things like that, you really gotta be wondering what's going on. It's like, you might be covering news. We want you to keep it secret. They told me I had hurt the feelings. Oh my God. Oh no, did some people get their fifis hurt? Because somebody was accurately calling what was happening over there genocide. Poor things. They told me I had hurt the feelings of some of my coworkers, but it was more than just to hurt feelings. Someone was accusing me of anti-Semitism. Yes, because calling out the Israeli government for genocide, according to Zionists, is being anti-Semitic. Here they are whining about hurt feelings while bodies are being buried under the rubble. I had, it appeared, crossed the line. Trying to work your way up to a permanent position at Canada's public broadcaster requires knowing the sorts of stories, angles, and guests that are acceptable and which are out of bounds. As precarious casual employees, a class of worker that make up over a quarter of CBC's workforce, it hadn't taken me long to realize that the subject of Israel-Palestine was to be avoided wherever possible. When it was covered, it was tactily expected to be framed in such a way as to obscure history and sanitize contemporary reality. If it weren't for TikTok and other places like Twitter, YouTube, this biased coverage from CBC and this type of coverage from other networks covering it the same way would be the only source of information people would be getting. And a lot of us still wouldn't know what was happening over there. I feel they only even ever acknowledged the deaths in Gaza because they couldn't deny them, because it is all over other medias. So they had to at least acknowledge it. But if it wasn't for that, I don't think they would have ever mentioned a death toll in Gaza. They would have kept that quiet. They would have talked about the bombings. They might have mentioned the Hamas militants that were being killed. But all the innocent people, again, it's not lying, it's omitting. But it is a lie by omission. I don't think they would have said anything if this wasn't all over social media. After October 7th, it was no longer possible for a corporation to continue avoiding it, but because CBC had never properly contextualized the world's longest active military occupation in the lead up to the atrocity, it was ill-equipped to report on what happened next. The CBC would spend the following months whitewashing the horrors that Israel would visit on Palestinians in Gaza. In the days after Israel began its bombing campaign, this was already evident. While virtually no scrutiny was applied to Israeli officials and experts, an unprecedented level of suspicion was being brought to bear on the family members of those trapped in Gaza. Keep in mind, again, not a single refugee from Gaza has actually made it over to Canada yet, even though at least 1,000 emergency visas were granted. But none of them have been able to make it over here. And so many people just saying that anyone from there, like no one, it's all over Zionist speak and stuff, that nobody from Gaza should be allowed to leave, basically. That they should all stay in there and suffer. That Canada shouldn't allow any of them in, even ones with families and connections here. Ones that are actually Canadian citizens that are trapped in Gaza. And some of these are the same people, Zionists, who were turned away from by Canada during the Second World War. They are now doing it to the people in Gaza. Absolutely tragic, horrific repetition. My job required me to vet work of associate producers and to oversee interviews, so I was well positioned to see double standards up close. At first, out of concern that it would jeopardize my chances of landing a staff job that I had recently applied for, I only voiced mild pushback. But as the death toll mounted, my career started to seem less important. If journalists in Gaza were sacrificing their lives to tell the truth, I should at least be prepared to take some risks. And that's why I have so much admiration for a lot of the students that you're seeing in Canada, in the United States. More so in the United States, too, because a lot of them, their diplomas are being threatened. They're being threatened with expulsions. They're being threatened with arrests. We did have some violent encounters from the police towards encampments in Alberta. Not to the same level as in the States. By being part of these encampments, these students are literally putting their lives on the line. They're constantly under attack by Zionists, by police not doing anything to protect them. They're doing what the leaders of this country should have been doing a long time ago. And more people in the government. Like, where are all the people in the government, calling out Justin Trudeau from his own party? One of my last live streams, there was one Liberal member I found calling what it was over there genocide. But where are the people within his party willing to lose their status as a Liberal, being willing to be kicked out of the caucus? Sarah Jama did. She got kicked out of the NDP caucus for calling it what it was just days after October 7th. Where are all these other people we've elected into office standing up and calling this what it is and challenging Justin Trudeau? Where are their spines? Did they shit them out in the morning? It shouldn't be up to civilians risking their lives, their jobs, their livelihood to do what the government should have been doing in the first place. Besides, I naively told myself it would be easier for me to dissent than most of my colleagues. I am of mixed Jewish heritage, have been raised by a father who fled the Holocaust as a young child and dealt with lifelong trauma and guilt of surviving while his family members were murdered by the Nazis. It would be more challenging, I believed, for cynical actors to wield false accusations of anti-Semitism against me. Yeah, we've been seeing a lot of, it doesn't matter who you are. If you're standing up to Zionists, if you're calling it a genocide, you all get labeled as Hamas supporters. Scholars, Jewish scholars, Holocaust survivors, parents and family members of the hostages, all of them suddenly become Hamas supporters because they're not stepping in line with everything the Zionists want. And as she says, I turned out to be wrong. The Palestine exception at CBC. In the run-up to October 7th, a senior colleague said that if we were lucky, the news gods would shine on us and put an end to the stretch of slow news days. Waking up that fateful Saturday to multiple alerts on my phone, I knew that both the world and my professional life were about to dramatically change. Even before October 2023, trying to persuade senior CBC colleagues to report accurately on Palestinians was a struggle. Here are some of the TV interview ideas that colleagues and I pitched but had turned down. Human Rights Watch 2021 report designating Israel apartheid state. The I don't, you know me and names. Evictions in that same year. Israel assassinating Palestinian American journalist Shari in 2022. The Israeli bombing of the Jenin refugee camp in 2023. See, Amnesty International has been calling this out for such a long time, like decades. The United Nations has been calling this out, and yet here is a public news broadcaster here in Canada that can't even report on things that are actually happening. Because now people are saying, well, this October 7th attack, it just came out of nowhere. When that's not the case. Palestinians have been trying to fight back in so many different ways. A few years ago, there was the, I forget what they call it, where they were just peacefully walking to the wall. Palestinians were just peacefully walking to the wall, and they were being sniped down. Hundreds died. Innocent people, medics, clearly labeled medics, children, were just sniped out of existence. Oh, but they might have had a rock. All the people being held in prison, all the Palestinians arbitrarily being held in prison, that's all been known. Amnesty International has been reporting on this for decades. But it came as a surprise to a lot of Canadians because we have public broadcasters, news networks, that never mention it. The only reason why I knew of it was because I got involved with Amnesty International. The last of these ideas was initially greenlit, but later canceled because a senior producer was concerned that a host would have too much on her plate. Around this time, I also pitched some ideas from the Israeli Human Rights Organization to talk about the potential impact of widely protested judicial reforms on Palestinians, but this was nixed for fear of complaints. Any news network that's afraid to actually report on the news because they might get complaints isn't a news network. They're a propaganda tool. These would become familiar excuses. Sorry, that just really bugs me, the fear of complaints thing, because that's why a lot of the right wing gets their way. Because centrist media, leftist media that's trying to look balanced and all that sort of stuff, they fear the complaints of the right wing. Like, how dare you cover this way? You know, and so they're constantly catering to the sensibilities of people who don't want others to know the truth. For a network that's receiving public funds, this is a disgrace. After October 7th, I dreaded going into work. Every shift, the impact of the biases went into overdrive. Even at this early stage, Israeli officials were making genocidal statements that were ignored in our coverage. On October 9th, Defense Minister Yoav Gallant said, "I have ordered a complete siege on the Gaza Strip. There will be no electricity, no food, no fuel. Everything is closed. We are fighting human animals, and we act accordingly." Again, if it wasn't for TikTok, Twitter, how many people would have even known that statement was made? Like, unless they're watching Al Jazeera News. Where was the mainstream media coverage of this statement? I don't recall seeing this on CTV News, on CB24, Globe and Mail. And I don't recall that. I'm not saying it wasn't there. I just don't recall it. Even after this comment, my executive producer was still quibbling over the uses of our scripts of the word besieged, or references to the plight of Palestinians. On October 20th, I suggested having Haman Farah, a Palestinian-Canadian psychotherapist, back on the network. In an earlier interview, he had told us that his family were sheltering in an Orthodox church in Gaza City. The following week, I learned from social media that his step-cousin had been killed in an Israeli airstrike on the 12th century building. That's quite the thing for somebody who's working in the news to have to learn through social media that this is happening. To actually have family members and you're learning through social media as opposed to, mainstream media. My executive producer responded to my pitch via instant message, yeah, if he's willing, but also may have potentially said we can't verify these things though unless we can. We could verify them. I was stunned. Never in my nearly 6 years at CBC had I ever been expected to verify the death of someone close to a guest, or to put a disclaimer in an interview that we couldn't fact-check such claims. That's not a standard that producers have been expected to uphold, except apparently for Palestinians. Besides, even at the early stage, civil society had completely broken down in Gaza. I couldn't just call up the health authority or courthouse to ask that they email over a death certificate. I already had the person's relative's full name and had found a Facebook profile matching a commemorative photo he had posted on Instagram. This was already more verification than I had done for Israeli interviewees who had loved ones killed on October 7th. A few days later, a different program on the network aired an interview with a guest using passive language in the headline, "Toronto man says relative was killed in airstrike that hit Gaza." I was being forced to walk a tightrope, trying to retain some journalistic integrity while keeping my career intact. In early November, I was asked to oversee production of an interview with a former U.S. official now working for the Washington Institute for Near East Policy, a pro-Israel think tank. During the interview, he was allowed to repeat a number of verifiable false claims live on air, including that Hamas fighters had decapitated babies on October 7th and that Gazan civilians could avoid being bombed if only they listened to the Israeli military and headed south. This was after civilian convoys fleeing southward via safe routes had been bombed by the Israeli military before the eyes of the world. So it's one thing to omit, it's another thing to have somebody on the network and just flat out lie without correcting them. The network has no excuse for this, none whatsoever. To have this level of journalistic integrity just be destroyed, to not do the bare minimum, to allow people on their network who lie and repeat verifiably false claims. I'm looking at you, TYT, home of progressives. I'm not against networks having differences of opinions on their teams. I am against a progressive network having a raging genocidal Zionist on their staff, giving him a platform while not providing that same platform to people who are Palestinian. But Cenk likes to say, well, then we can push back. Only not all the time, because he made at least one Rebel HQ video where he was spewing out all of these lies about the decapitated babies and the rapes and all this sort of stuff. That was on a Rebel HQ video and there was no pushback. He got to say whatever the hell he wanted and it was published on their network. Like, it is one thing to have a genocidal Zionist come on for a spot and have a debate. It's another thing to be paying them, to be giving them a platform, to legitimizing it as a both sides issue by keeping this person on staff. Like, of all the disgusting things TYT has done recently, this one takes a cake, by far. To allow Ben Cleve to be part of that network after all the bullshit he has spewed. Back to the article. As soon as I heard this second falsehood, I messaged my team suggesting that the host push back, but received no response. Afterwards, the host said she had let the comment slide because time was limited. Yeah, you better not correct a grievous mistake like that or a grievous lie like that, because you know what? TikTok, TikTok. Even though she could have taken the time from a less consequential story later on the program. The majority of Palestinian guests I spoke to during the first 6 weeks of Israel's assault in Gaza all said the same thing. They wanted to do live interviews to avoid the risk of their words being edited or their interview not being aired. These were well-founded concerns. Okay, again, on a public news broadcaster, people shouldn't have to be worried about them taking their words out of context. That should not have to be something people who are sitting down to an interview with the CBC that should not be crossing their mind. That somehow their words will be taken out of context. Never before in my career has so many interviews been canceled due to fear of what guests might say, nor had there ever been direction from senior colleagues to push a certain group of people to do pre-taped interviews. CBC told The Breach it categorically rejects the claims that interviews were routinely canceled. On another occasion in November, a Palestinian-Canadian woman in London, Ontario, named Reem, who had family trapped in the Strip, was scheduled for one such pre-taped interview. Because of her frustration over previous interviews that she had given and covered of her family's situation being diluted, she asked if she could go live instead. When I asked the senior producer, he looked uneasy and said the interview should be canceled, citing the guest had already been on the network that week. Oh, because I'm sure, they've never had a Zionist on there more than once. Within a week, within a day. I agreed that it would be preferable to interview a new Palestinian voice and said I had contact information for a number of alternative guests. However, after canceling the interview with Reem, the senior producer, informed me that he didn't want another guest after all. Imagine that. Editing out genocide. Most shows on the network seem to avoid airing any mention of genocide in the context of Gaza. On November 10th, my senior producer pushed and canceled an interview I had set up with Palestinian-Canadian entrepreneur Khalid. According to his pre-interview conversation that typically happens before the broadcastable interview, 50 of his relatives have been killed by Israeli soldiers. The part of the transcript that concerned the senior producer was his claim that Netanyahu's government had publicly disclosed its intent to commit genocide, which it did. He also took issue with the guest's reference to documented history of racism and apartheid under Israeli occupation, as well as his suggestion that Canadian government was complicit in the murder of Gazan civilians. Which is true. That's all true. The senior producer raised concerns via email executive producer, who then CC'd one of the higher-up managers. This executive producer replied that it sounded like his statement was beyond opinion and factually incorrect. The executive manager's higher-up chimed in saying she thought the interview would be too risky as a pre-tape or live interview. It's pretty bad when they're saying, yeah, we don't even want to do the pre-tape because they might speak some truth that we can't just edit around. Despite the guest's position aligning with many UN experts and Western human rights organizations, the interview was canceled. CBC told The Breach the guest turned down our offer of a pre-taped interview, but he had said to the producers from the start that he would only do a live interview. Never in my nearly 6 years at CBC had I ever been expected to verify. Okay, yeah, that was already stated. In another instance, a Palestinian Canadian guest named Sama, whose elderly father was then trapped in Gaza, had part of her pre-taped interview edited out before it went to air. She had used the word genocide and talked about deliberate starvation of Palestinians in Gaza. What does CBC think they are? A YouTube channel? They don't have to worry about, strikes against their channel or their video being demonetized because of that. The senior producer told me the edit was because of time constraints, but that the producer and the host were overheard agreeing that the guest's unedited words were too controversial. Again, public broadcasters shouldn't be afraid of reporting on the news. CBC told The Breach it had not canceled interviews with the Palestinians because they referenced genocide and apartheid. Of course they wouldn't admit to it. By November 2023, it was getting harder to ignore the brazen rhetoric coming from senior Israeli officials and the rate of civilian deaths, which had few precedents in the 21st century. But you wouldn't have heard about these things on our show, despite a number of producers' best efforts. By early 2024, the International Court of Justice hearings and later its ruling that Israel refrained from actions that could plausibly constitute genocide forcibly changed the discussion, and the word genocide finally made its appearance on CBC. But back in late October, I booked an interview with associate professor of global communication at Simon Fraser University, to talk about language and propaganda from Israeli and Hamas officials. The host filling in that day was afraid of complaints and was concerned about the guest wanting to be interviewed live, and judged him to be biased. Because, yeah, they do a bias check on everyone before they do an interview there. Yet again, an interview was canceled. A secret blacklist? One Saturday in mid-October, I arrived at work shortly after airing of an interview with a prominent Palestinian-Canadian lawyer and former spokesperson for the Palestinian Liberation Organization, Diana. But there had been a commotion, I was told. Commotion in the news place. We have somebody that might speak the truth. Oh no! A producer from The National, the CBC's flagship nightly news and current affairs program, had apparently stormed into the newsroom during the interview, saying that Diana was on a list of banned Palestinian guests and that we weren't supposed to book her. I heard from multiple colleagues that the alleged list of banned Palestinian guests wasn't official, rather a number of pro-Israel producers who were rumored to have drawn up their own list of guests to avoid. That should not be allowed in a public news broadcaster. To have people's personal biases restrict who can and cannot come onto the show. Later, I was told by the producer of the interview that after the broadcast, Diana's details had mysteriously vanished from a shared CBC database. By then, I had also discovered that the name and contact detail for the Palestinian ambassador, Mona, who had previously been interviewed, had likewise been removed. It didn't seem coincidental that both guests were articulate defenders of Palestinian rights. While producers distressed by CBC's coverage of Gaza were speaking in whispers, pro-Israeli colleagues felt comfortable making dehumanizing comments about Palestinians in the newsroom. In one case, I heard an associate producer speak disparagingly about a guest's decision to wear a keffiyeh for an interview before commenting that the host knows how to handle these people. This guest had dozens of family members killed by the Israeli military in Gaza. It seemed the only Palestinian guest CBC was interested in interviewing was the sad, docile Palestinian who talked about their suffering without offering any analysis or solutions to end it. What they did not want was an angry Palestinian full of righteous indignation towards governments complicit in their family's displacement and murder. At this stage, I was starting to feel nauseous at work, and then one Saturday night, the sickness turned into anger. I had been asked to finish a production on a pre-tape interview with a constructive dialogue researcher on incidences of campus hostilities over the war and how to bring people together, the sort of interview CBC loves, as it's a way to be seen covering the story without actually talking about what's happening in Gaza. I carried out the task in good faith, writing an introduction leading with an example of anti-Semitism and another of anti-Palestinian hate, taking care to be balanced in my approach. Why bother? Like, if they're not going to be balanced, why do you have to go out of your way to try to be balanced, to make you look like you're the good one? Like, oh, look at me, I'm still looking for the other side. The other side gets plenty of coverage already. It's just, there should be no need to feel like, well, I should also mention. No, you don't have to. Just like you don't have to condemn what Hamas has done every time there's an interview about what's happening in Gaza. And if anyone were to ask me that question live on air, I would tell them to go fuck themselves. But my senior producer proceeded to remove the example of anti-Palestinian hate, replacing it with a wishy-washy, both sides example, while leaving the specific serious incident of anti-Semitism intact. He also edited my wording to suggest that pro-Palestinian protesters on Canadian campuses were on the side of Hamas. This is devastating for this news network to have this information out. Like, it's just completely removing the veil, completely. Like, all the people who were suspecting now know, and people who were clueless as to what was happening now know. CBC needs to be held accountable for their lack of journalistic integrity on this. Absolutely. They are a publicly funded broadcaster, Canadian corporation broadcaster. They need to be held to a certain standard. At least, respecting the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. But they need to be held to a certain standard. And if they can't do that, then they need a complete and utter overhaul. People there need to lose their jobs. And I don't mean in the way that Pierre Poilievre says that, oh, they all need to lose their jobs. No. I believe in having a publicly funded Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. That they would have the resources to do a lot of what other news networks can't do. They would have that security and that funding to know that they were always there. I believe in the purpose of it, but they need to be nonpartisan and not biased. And if they can't do that, they need to be completely overhauled. And not only completely overhauled, there needs to be very strict guidelines of what is acceptable there so that there's no wishy-washy going on later on. There needs to be like a set, standard, a list of things that they must check off when they're covering stories in order to be considered credible in the future. I overheard the host thank the senior producer for the edits on the biases that incidents of anti-Semitism were supposedly worse. While the introduction of these biases into my script were relatively minor compared to some other double standards I witnessed, it was a tipping point. I challenged the senior on I challenged the senior on why he had made my script journalistically worse. He made up a bad excuse. I told him I couldn't do this anymore and walked out of the newsroom crying. Truth telling about CBC. That evening at home, the nausea and anger dissolved, and for the first time in 6 weeks, I felt a sense of peace. I knew it was unattainable to stay at CBC. At a team meeting the following week in mid-November, I said things that I had wanted to say since the start of Israel's assault on Gaza. I prefaced the conversation by saying how much I loved my team and considered some of my coworkers friends. I said the problems weren't unique to our team, but across the CBC. But the frequency of Palestinian guests getting canceled and the pressure to pre-tape this one particular group, in addition to the unprecedented level of scrutiny being placed on them, demonstrated a pattern of double standards. I said there seems to be an unspoken rule around the words like genocide. I pointed out that Arab and Muslim co-workers, especially those who were precariously employed, were scared of raising concerns, and that I and others had heard dehumanizing comments about Palestinians in the newsroom. The CBC told the Breach there had been no specific reports of anti-Palestinian and Islamophobic comments in the newsroom for managers to respond to or follow up, because a lot of those people would be afraid to speak up in the first place. Because who are you going to go to there? The HR? Can you really trust that they would support you if you go up and say that some of the higher ups have said something offensive, hateful, derogatory? Do you think your jobs be that secure? Because as we've seen across the country, Palestinians' employment is not secure at all. There's been university professors to lose their jobs, other journalists to lose their jobs. People in other professions, speaking engagements, all lose their jobs because they're standing up for Palestinians. So is it any shock that there might not be any specific reports of this when they know very well that if they were to report it, their job is on the line? I said that 2 decades since the US-led invasion of Iraq, it was widely acknowledged that the media had failed to do their jobs to interrogate the lies used to justify the war and occupation that killed 1 million Iraqis, and that as journalists we had special responsibility to tell the truth, even if it was uncomfortable. A couple of co-workers raised similar concerns. Others rolled their eyes. CBC told the Breach that it doesn't recall there was anyone who raised concerns in the meeting, but audio recordings show otherwise. Yeah, CBC, we don't recall anyone rolling their eyes either. Like, we weren't looking, but we don't recall seeing it. The question of why there was nervousness around this issue came up. I said one reason why they were adverse to following Palestinian guests to use the G word was because of complaint campaigns of right-wing lobby groups like Honest Reporting Canada. Gotta love conservatives in the right wing always using doublespeak when it comes to naming things. Like the Safety for Children Act, or when you know it's anything but. The Family Foundation Act thing. The Better Environment, like you know it's all doublespeak. Indeed, just 6 weeks, there were already 19 separate incidents of honest reporting going after CBC journalists. I don't know who this honest reporting is. I'm going to have to look into that. Honest reporting going after CBC journalists, including a host on our team. Honest reporting had also claimed responsibility for the firing at 2 other outlets of 2 Palestinian journalists, one of who was on maternity leave at the time. All this had a chilling effect. Hosts and senior colleagues would frequently cite the threat of complaints as a reason not to cover Israel-Palestine. And during my time there, a senior writer was even called into management meetings to discuss her supposed bias after Honest Reporting campaign targeted her. Her contract was cut short. Anyone, again, if you have a network that's susceptible to, complaints, that they're not going to report on things because they're worried about complaints, and then you have a dishonest actor, like Honest Reporting, purposely trying to get people fired, it's a recipe for suppression, fear, for keeping stories under wraps, for the right getting what they want. The right wing has way too much power in our media simply because our media is too chicken shit to report the truth. This policing of media workers' output reinforces existing institutional tendencies that ensure CBC rarely deviated from the narrow spectrum of legitimate opinions represented by Canada's existing political class. And that's the thing. It's CBC isn't biased towards the Liberals, not biased towards conservative. They're biased towards the status quo, the political class, the corporations, the institutions. They always have been. That needs to change. Certain CBC shows seem to be more biased than others. The National was particularly bad. The network's primetime show featured 42% more Israeli voices than Palestinians in its first month of coverage after October 7th mass attacks, according to the survey by The Breach. Although some podcasts and radio programs seem to cover the war on Gaza in a more nuanced way, the problem of anti-Palestinian biases in language was pervasive across all platforms. According to an investigation in The Breach, CBC even admitted to this disparity by arguing that only the killings of Israelis merited the term murderous or brutal, since the killings of Palestinians happens remotely. So, because you can push a button from a room and send a drone over to drop bombs, that's not brutal because you don't have to see it firsthand. Horrible. Images of children being flattened to death in between floors of apartment buildings and reports of premature babies left to starve in incubators suggested otherwise. And we covered that quote. I spoke to many like-minded colleagues to see if there was any action we could take to push back on the tenor of coverage, but understandably others were reluctant to act, even collectively, out of fear of doing so would endanger their jobs. You know what? Those aren't jobs worth having. If you're a journalist and this is the way this network is acting, you shouldn't be a journalist. That's not a job worth having. And I understand it's difficult and people have all these things going on, but your job shouldn't require you to sell your soul. That's not in a job description that you must give up your soul in order to work there. And that's exactly what they are doing. And I know it's hard to step away from situations like that. But at some point, you have to. And you have to speak out. This can't be allowed to continue. Some of those colleagues would have loved to have walked out, but financially responsibilities stopped them. And that's a problem with our government. You see, guaranteed livable income, if we had that, things like this, these corporations could be held accountable because people wouldn't be so afraid to lose their jobs that they could actually walk out on them and hold them to a higher standard because they knew that if they did that, they wouldn't be left with nothing and face losing their homes or healthcare coverage and all that sort of stuff. It's part of the reason why the government doesn't want a basic income or a guaranteed livable income, because it would hurt the capitalist system way too much by forcing them to raise their standards to keep people employed. There has been previous attempts at CBC to improve the public broadcaster's coverage of Israel-Palestine. In 2021, hundreds of Canadian journalists signed an open letter calling out biases in the mainstream media's treatment of the subject. A number of CBC workers who signed the letter were hauled into meetings and told they either weren't allowed to cover the subject or would have any future work on the issue vetted. A work friend later regretted signing the letter because she got the sense that she had been branded as biased, leading to her pitches on Palestine being more readily dismissed. Smeared as anti-Semitic. In mid-November, after laying out my concerns to my colleagues, the regular weekly pitch meeting took place. It was then that I pitched the two genocide scholars before having to attend the virtual meeting with my executive producer, where he suggests I go on mental health leave, and yet another meeting with two managers who raised concerns over my pitch the next day. But the most unpleasant meeting with management was about to come. A week later, I was accused of anti-Semitism on the basis of something I didn't even say. According to managers, someone had accused me of claiming that the elephant in the room was the rich Jewish lobby. CBC told The Breach that employees expressed concerns that what she said was discriminatory. The accusation was deeply painful because of my Jewish heritage and how my dad's life and consequence of my own was profoundly damaged by anti-Semitism. But I also knew I could prove that It was baseless. I had recorded what I said, anxious that someone might twist my words to use them against me. What I had actually said verbatim was this: I just want to address the elephant in the room. The reasons why we're scared to allow Palestinian guests on to use the word genocide is because there's a very, very well-funded, there's lots of Israel lobbies, and every time we do this sort of interview, they will complain, and it's a headache. That's why we're not doing it, but that's not a good reason not to have these conversations. I stand by my statement. Honest Reporting Canada is billionaire funded. In December 2023, Honest reported, I really need to look up this thing, Honest Reporting. Honest Reporting bragged about having mobilized Canadians to send 50,000 letters to news outlets. The group has also published a litany of attacks on journalists at CBC and other publications who've done accurate reporting on Palestine and created email templates to make it easier for their followers to complain to publications about specific reporters. And that's, I would say a lot of this then is on the networks. If they're getting swamped with honest reporting, they should be able to just dismiss it as a campaign. Similar to what happened to Sam Cedar when he lost his job at MSNBC because of a tweet from long ago, and the right wing using it to attack him and get him fired. Our media needs to wake up to this reality that these types of campaigns happen. And if they can't combat that, they shouldn't be in charge. It's their responsibility to protect their reporters from this kind of harassment as well. And if they just give in to honest reporting, then again, they're not being a news network, they're being a propaganda tool. Other similar pro-Israel groups like the Committee for Accuracy in the Middle East Reporting in America, CAMERA, and the Canary Mission employ similar tactics to try to silence journalists, academics, and activists who tell the truth about Israel-Palestine. I told the manager it was telling that instead of following up on the racist comment that I heard from colleagues about Palestinians, I was the one being accused of anti-Semitism and discrimination on the basis of words I hadn't even uttered. A banality of whitewashing war crimes. When I handed in my resignation on November 30th, I felt relieved that I was no longer complicit in the manufacturing of consent for a genocidal war of revenge. Despite my experience, I still believed in the importance of national broadcaster to act in the public interest of reporting independently of both government and corporate interests, presenting the truth and offering a diverse range of perspectives. And this is what I believe the importance of a national broadcaster is. It'd just be nice if we actually had one that did that. However, I believe that CBC has not been fulfilling these duties when it comes to its coverage of Israel-Palestine. And the thing is that we see it so clearly with this one because we have all the footage, we have all the information, the knowledge, and the facts of what's happening over there. If they're doing it with this, and this is just so blatant, how can you trust anything else they cover? How do we not know that they're being this biased with other stories that they're doing? Like, they need complete transparency on everything now because, again, this one is just so blatant that everyone can see what they were doing. Even before this article came out, it was becoming very obvious because on social media, we see the truth. So if they're still doing it despite that, then how much of their reporting is bias? And we just don't know any difference because it's not out wide enough on social media for us to know what the actual truth is. When they do this for one story, it tarnishes their reputation with everything else. People at CBC need to get fired and replaced, and a set standard needs to be put in place to make sure that it is a national broadcaster to act in the public interest. I believe that in future, historians will examine the many ways that CBC and the rest of the mainstream media have all failed to report truthfully on this unfolding genocide, and is doing so likely accelerated their delegitimizing as trusted news sources. Yeah, a lot less people are trusting mainstream media. And to be fair, it's not just the CBC. Most mainstream media has been doing a piss poor job of covering this. Before resigning, I raised the issue of double standards with various levels of the CBC hierarchy. While some members of management pledged to take my concerns seriously, the overall response left me disappointed with the state of the public broadcaster. Sorry, just having a thought catch up to my brain. I see like Emma and Sam at the Majority Report get attacked a fair bit for their reporting on it, but they also get a lot of praise for their reporting. Because again, there's just so many people out there who have never seen the unbiased reporting of this. And so to suddenly see what is happening over there can be shocking to the point that they don't want to believe it's real. That this just came out of the blue for them. They don't know the history. They don't know about all the other attempts. They don't, like, how many people have said that it's in the Hamas charter that they want to do a genocide of Jewish people? Okay, that's not true. That's not in their current charter. And some people might say, well, it was at one point. And it's like, does that matter? Can't nations change? Tell that to Germany. Tell that to South Africa. Nations can change. But we have so many people that don't want to accept this reality because it is horrific. And they don't want to acknowledge that they have been supporting governments that are complicit in it, complicit in even supporting it. It's a hard pill to swallow, but it needs to be done. We need to call out our governments. Like, I hope the ICC goes after people in my government for what they've done when it comes to this. It'd be nice if they went after people in my government for other things too, like, the residential schools or something. After my appeal to my coworkers in mid-November, I had a phone conversation with sympathetic senior producer. He said he didn't think my words at the meeting would interfere with my chances of getting a permanent staff job I've dreamed of. Oh, I remembered getting that dream job. Had that dream job at TYT. Yeah. It's, that's the thing about getting a dream job is when you get it, it becomes reality. And when it becomes reality, you realize it's not a dream. Despite this assurance, I was certain that I wouldn't get it now. I knew I'd crossed the line for saying out loud what many at CBC were thinking but couldn't say openly. Indeed, I wouldn't have spoken out if I hadn't already decided to resign. As a kid, I had fantasies of shooting Hitler dead to stop the Holocaust. I couldn't fathom how most Germans went along with it. Then in my 20s, I was gifted a copy of Hanan's a book, a report on the banality of evil by anti-Zionist Israeli friends. I have been thinking a lot about that piece of reportage when trying to make sense of the liberal media's complicity of obfuscating the reality of what's happening in the Holy Land. As they theorize, those who go along with genocide aren't innately evil. They're often just boring careerists. To be sure, while there are a number of senior CBC journalists who are clearly committed to defending Israel no matter its actions, many journalists just follow the path of least resistance. The fact that permanent full-time CBC jobs are in such supply, combined with threats of looming cuts, only reinforces this problem. Guaranteed livable income. Just saying, would get rid of that problem in a heartbeat. I still hear from former colleagues that pitch meetings are uphill battles. Some shows are barely covering Gaza anymore. Being a journalist is a huge privilege and responsibility, especially in a time of war. Well, you can go independent. A lot of people have. Start a YouTube channel. You're curating the news for an audience, deciding which factors to include and which to omit, choosing whose perspectives to present and whose to ignore. I had that joke before. It's like, it's not the news you need to know. It's the news we want you to know. I believe that a good journalist should be able to turn their critical eye not just on the news, but on their own reporting of the news. If you're unable to do this, you shouldn't be in the profession. I purposely haven't given away identifiable information about my former colleagues. Ultimately, this isn't about them or me. It's part of a much wider issue in newsrooms across the country and the Western world. And I believe it's a moral duty to shed light on it. If I didn't, I'd never forgive myself. Just as I'm not naming my colleagues, I'm writing this using a pseudonym. Although the spectrum of acceptable discourse continues to shift, the career consequences for whistleblowing on this issue remains formidable. I encourage fellow journalists who refuse to participate in the whitewashing of war crimes, especially those with security of staff jobs, to speak to like-minded coworkers about taking the collective action. Yeah, I remember seeing something along those lines. People who have, secure staff jobs at TYT maybe mentioning something about the transphobia going on there. That would have been nice. That feels like a lifetime ago. The people with job security within that network who stayed silent, it's very disappointing. Especially those with security of staff jobs, to speak to like-minded coworkers about taking collective action, to approach your union steward and representatives, to document instances of double standards in your newsroom and share them with other media workers. It was scary, but I have no regrets about speaking out. My only regret is that I didn't write this sooner. If you can, please go support The Breach. They're doing great work. Rachel Gilmore. She's an amazing independent journalist here in Canada, and she has a TikTok about this Breach article. But it's also important because she also was confronted with this sort of biases in her reporting and couldn't stay where she was because, reporting the truth is so dangerous type thing. So it's still, I feel, it's important to watch this and support her. And it's just a couple minutes long, so let's get into it. A lot of this will just be repeating what we saw, but she does have a fair bit to add to the story.
A former CBC producer is breaking her silence about the double standards and discrimination she observed in the broadcaster's coverage of Palestine. She spoke out in a piece published by The Breach that everyone is reading right now, and you should too. In it, she alleges Palestinian guests were subjected to unheard levels of scrutiny, describes apparent retaliation in response to speaking out, painstaking efforts taken to avoid airing the word genocide, and even, quote, an alleged list of banned Palestinian guests as, quote, a number of pro-Israel producers were rumored to have drawn up their own list of guests to avoid. The allegations in this piece are significant enough that Canada's Special Representative on Combating Islamophobia, Amira Al-Gawabi, requested a meeting with CBC President Catherine Tate because the piece, she said, was a, quote, extremely disturbing read that resurfaces serious questions about anti-Palestinian bias at Canada's public broadcaster.
And that is this tweet right here. So she read it in full, so I don't need to reread it. So this is Amira here at Canada's Special Representative Combating Islamophobia. Yeah, that Breach article was definitely raising alarm bells when she's reading it saying, this is deeply disturbing and resurfaces serious questions.
The Breach has been doing incredible reporting on this issue, especially from its senior editor, Emma Paling, who reported that in response to complaints about its coverage, CBC said the killing of Palestinians doesn't merit using terms like murderous or brutal because, CBC argued, Israel carries out those killings remotely.
And that's this article here. I'm not going to read over this whole article for everyone because we just went through an entire article and there's still a couple articles that we're going to be going through. I will link this in the description box below for people.
Paling also reported that CTV, which also runs CP24 and BNN Bloomberg, directed journalists not to use the word Palestine and cultivated a culture of fear, suppressing critical coverage of Israel's war on Gaza.
And this is one of the problems we have with our media empires, is that they're all owned by the same people. Like there's a few groups of people, some are right-wing, some are kind of centrist establishment status quo. But it's the same problem down in the States where you have a few people that own all these different news networks. And so you think when you're reading something from CTV News versus Global News versus CP24 that you're getting different takes, different biases and stuff, when it's often all of the same things. And if you look at the articles, one thing to look out for, we'll get to this one later, is you look here. This will tell you if it's a Canadian press article, because a lot of them just pull. Like I was looking for information on a certain story, and so I was like copying and pasting actual print from the article, and all these other articles from all these other networks popped up because they were all using the same article from the Canadian press. We sometimes think we have diverse news and ranging things and all that sort of stuff. We don't, not in mainstream media. And I covered this more back when I was doing the video essays with certain stories because of just how frustrating coverage was and trying to find out opposing views and getting information. But it's important for Canadians to know that our news is not that much different than the United States when it comes to monopolies of ownership.
Sounds familiar. When I worked for a major national news outlet, I tweeted this, which you can pause to read.
So she had tweeted out in response to Sanad Saeed. Last year, over 200 of us wrote signed letters called on our industry to start doing its job to report accurately, fairly, justly on Israeli occupation. Almost exactly a year later, we see how little, unsurprising, has changed. And so Rachel quote tweeted that, saying Canada also needs to reckon with how we report and discuss Israeli-Palestine conflict. It's a disservice to everyone affected when we fail to acknowledge major atrocities and systemic discrimination against Palestinians. And this was back in May 13th, 2022. So this was quite a long time ago that Rachel was, reporting on the right side of this issue. Our job is to afflict the comfortable and comfort the afflicted. When it comes to talking about Israel and Palestine, we sometimes seem to forget that balance. So as you can see, Rachel does phenomenal work, has been on the right side of this issue for years.
And I got a message from management telling me that tweet was biased. My work also refused to publish a story I worked painstakingly to report on Shireen Abu Akleh being killed by the IDF, in which I spoke to 4 people who knew her, including the cameraman who filmed her murder. In the email informing me the story didn't meet the standards for publication, I was told there was essentially only 1 person interviewed for the story when there were 4, and the word melodramatic was used. After my layoff, I reported it independently, and you guys sure seem to think that it was a story worth telling. Saying this stuff is terrifying, but the only way to fix our journalistic failings is to talk about them. And to quote the CBC producer who spoke out, if journalists in Gaza were sacrificing their lives to tell the truth, I should at least be prepared to take some risks. What do you think of all this?
Yeah, so go follow her on all of her social medias and everything. So that's not it. There's still another component to this story. This ruffled some feathers at CBC. There's a news editor blog in response to this. I haven't read it yet. We're going to find out what it says together. It's absolutely like this. This tells you the power of accurate and good journalism when another news network feels like they actually have to respond to a call out. It's not like Fox News saying, oh, we're being attacked by politicians. It is another news network with a whistleblower calling them out to the point where they're like, we should probably say something to this because it looks kind of bad. So we're going to find out what CBC actually says about this. News editor's blog, uncovering one of the most divisive stories in years. No one story or interview will capture the complexity of the Israel-Hamas war. No, so that's why you should have multiple ones, stories and interviews from multiple perspectives covering this. Sorry, I don't normally read this part of it, but I'm kind of curious. A control room at the Canadian Broadcasting Centre in Toronto. Newsrooms around the world have struggled with how to fairly and accurately cover the divisive Israel-Hamas war. No, I don't think they've been struggling. Reporters, journalists have been struggling on how to cover it only because the networks have been threatening to, can them should they actually speak out. Yeah, it's pretty bad when the editor's blog is being used to be like, yeah, so that other article over there, well, this is our side of it. Funny how they want, both sides to be expressed equally when it comes to this, but not with the other thing. We use this editor's blog to explain our journalism and what's happening at CBC News. You can find more blogs here. No, thank you. I was disappointed to read the account of a former employee published in The Breach who claimed CBC News coverage of Israel-Hamas war has whitewashed Israel's actions in Gaza. I bet you were disappointed to read that. First, its broad conclusions are not true, but that other person said they had receipts. And also, again, everyone who's aware of the news and can read can tell you've been biased on this. You didn't need an expose article for that. We don't whitewash or censor our journalism. Bullshit. Completely biased coverage. The CBC. I continue to point people to archive of our coverage since October 7th that puts the lie to generalizations about our bias, missing perspectives, and censorship. Please look and judge yourself. Wait, why do we have to put the work into actually doing this? That's your job. We don't, you could put like a list of the articles and say, this is who was here, this is what. Why are you asking us to put in the work to see if you're an honest news network? That's not the responsibility of the readers here. To please look and judge for yourself. Oh. It's your responsibility to report to us, not our responsibility to do an investigation into you. The CBC provided the breach with comprehensive reply to questions about specific events that happened months ago, but we are prevented from discussing the details here because of rules around employee confidentiality. Sure. That said, there's no doubt some CBC journalists will see this account moments that ring true to their own experience, moments where we have not lived up to the values of inclusivity, times when we have stumbled, when we were too careful or not careful enough. That sounds like an answer to like a job interview question. Where clumsy words or interpretation of principles or a loud voice at a story meeting led them to feel and continue to feel marginalized and isolated and alone. This is like a, did they just take this off of a PowerPoint slide from an inclusivity, a sensitivity training seminar? Like that's what this sounds like. That's just right off of a PowerPoint slide from a sensitivity training. Yeah, it's like, okay, so when you've been called out for doing something wrong, you need to step back and say and acknowledge that we have stumbled and that sometimes, you're too careful or you're not careful enough, and acknowledge again that you could be clumsy with words and that interpretation of principles might not get around, or somebody being very vocal at the meeting can cause others to have an emotional reaction to that they'll internalize and make them feel marginalized and isolated and alone. And it's important that as a business that you acknowledge this and say, not us, we're the good ones, and we see you. Yeah, no, we will not say anything else because of employee confidentiality. Among the systemic, and yes, I'm being extraordinarily biased in my interpretation of this and one-sided because fuck the CBC. Again, we've known this has been going on for a long, long time. Anyone who's really plugged into the news, and it's not, and it's bad enough when it is landlords and it's just constant coverage of the poor landlords, and they might have a teeny tiny story every now and then about tenants being forced out onto the streets and stuff of that sort. But to do this for a fucking genocide that we can see with our eyes, I'm sorry, I have no sympathy for this corporation, and they can go to hell. And yes, I am going to continue to read this in a very biased, one-sided way because they don't deserve my, what's the word? My consideration. They don't deserve it. Among the systemic issues we are currently addressing, newsroom culture is a challenge we are seized with at the CBC, one we are continually working to improve. Again, this is just from a slide from a PowerPoint in a sensitivity training workshop. That's all this is. To be clear, we are... Wow, this really is just a PowerPoint display here. To be clear, we are micros. I know the word. I know it. I know it. It's just I've been talking a lot, reading a lot. I know the word. Anyway, we are just a small reflection of the world we're covering and the public we serve. And this is one of the most divisive stories we've covered in years. How many of us have friends or family pulled apart by this story? How many? That has literally been happening to the people in Gaza. Friends and families pulled apart. How many of us have felt anger or sadness when talking to someone who is ignorant of the story's history and complexities? Well, if only we had a national broadcaster that had been, honestly reporting on this for the past however long this corporation has existed. Complaints about coverage come from both sides, but they only ever listen to one. They only ever take action to one side. We've received hundreds of public complaints through our Ombudsman and Standards Office about our reporting on this conflict since October 7th. About 55% of complaints through CBC was unfair to Israel, and about 45% through the CBC was unfair to Palestinians. Prove it. Sorry, I can't take your word on this one. Can't. Prove it. Show me the numbers. Show me the stats. We have been told that we are not going hard enough on the human catastrophe unfolding in Gaza and beyond. Not going hard enough. You're just not being accurate. That's all. Some fear we are minimizing the destruction of people and the deaths of thousands. You did it. You did it right there. Right there. You're missing a word. Well, two words. You did it right in this fucking article, CBC. Some fear we are minimizing the destruction of a people and the deaths of tens of thousands. You're missing the tens of. And the deaths of tens of thousands of innocent Palestinians trapped within the borders they can't leave. You did it in this fucking article. You minimized it in the exact sentence. Wow. They worry we are trying too hard to balance with Israel's perspective. This is a fucking job interview. Oh, what's your weakness? We work too hard. They worry we are trying too hard to balance with Israeli perspectives on reporting on a fight in which they see no balance. There is no balance to it. Israel has all the power. They have all the weapons, all the support, all the military, all the personnel. Like, come on. There is no balance there. And we hear from people who feel we are not going hard enough on the disturbing rise of anti-Semitism. Already been over that a bunch of times. Real anti-Semitism, bad. That's not all that's contributing to the rise. A lot of it is just, oh no, from the river to the sea, Palestine must be free. Oh no, that counts as anti-Semitism. And what they deem as anti-Semitism disguised as criticisms of Israel. Right there. They believe our coverage moved on far too quickly from the horrors of October 7th. Well, considering it so comes up in every single goddamn article, I don't think so. Nobody has forgotten about October 7th. Nobody has been allowed to forget about October 7th. Every time you go on a show, you're still asked to condemn October 7th. That's not quickly from the horrors of October 7th. How about to the horrors of what's happening in Gaza? Can you say that? The horrors of the deaths of tens of thousands of innocent Palestinians? And how horrific that is. I'm getting really snarky now, aren't I? That we give airtime to anti-Israel members of the Jewish community who don't represent the majority, and that there is not enough journalism on Israel's efforts to defend itself. Israel has a right to defend itself. Go ask Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. He can't go 3 sentences about talking about Israel without saying that. Nobody is worried about that. Nobody except for Zionists is worried about that. There's not anti-Israel people getting tons of airtime anywhere. I would imagine the majority of the Jewish community don't actually support a genocide. I'm just, spitballing there. I don't believe that because Jewish and Zionism are not the same thing. And there are Jewish people who are not Zionists, and there are Zionists who are not Jewish. There's plenty of journalism on Israel's right to defend itself. That's not a missing piece here. No one story or interview will capture the totality of the ongoing events in the Middle East, and that's never our aim. Rather, we will be judged on a body of work over time. We're judging you on your body of work. I believe that body of work speaks for itself and demonstrates our values of independence, impartiality, accuracy, and balance. Well, you see, if you can't even honestly say that, then no. You're no good at analysis if this is what you're saying, because if you're saying this demonstrates your values, then your values are very biased, not independent, not impartial. Accuracy, again, I don't think they flat out lie, but they will allow people on who lie and then not correct them. So, I don't know. I'm also dismayed at the prospect that one article can undermine the work of so many CBC news journalists who have worked very hard to get it right, to tell this challenging story over time with the nuanced perspectives and contradictions inherent in it. I really hope now other people from the CBC start speaking up and supporting this whistleblower. There needs to be others within the network standing up right now. We have dedicated more effort, resources, money into covering this story across all of our platforms than any other news organization in Canada. That's entirely possible, actually. But how accurate that is, resources and money, I can see that. That said, our coverage of this story will never be able to satisfy everyone's expectations because the story itself is so personal and divisive. You really love using this word in here. Was that on your word-a-day calendar, divisive, before you wrote this? Could you not just, do a thesaurus word in Word check? I do that all the time. That's why at the heart of everything we do are so horrible. Never put R and R together in a sentence. That's just my personal thing. That's why at the heart of everything we do are our journalistic standards and practices. Those are just 2 lousy words to have together, that's all. It's English. It's tutoring English to a refugee, trying to explain the difference between A-R-E and O-U-R, even though they sound the exact same. Anyway, they help guide us so that we are consistent as possible in our journalism, despite the emotions and biases we all bring to the workplace. They admitted they bring biases to the workplace there. And they are consistent in their biases. And you, the public we serve, can and should hold us accountable to those standards. Done. I'm doing it. Holding you accountable. CBC's Independent Ombudsman Office conveys your thoughtful feedback and criticism to us, and we are committed to addressing every concern through the lens of accuracy, fairness, and we continue to strive for stronger journalism. I need to click on this link. Is there a way of contacting them? I'm just saying there might be a way to contact. Oh, make a complaint right there. After this show, please check the description box below. Just saying, this might be available for people to talk to the ombudsman. Looks into complaints related to the following: News, current affairs, public affairs, radio, television, news content, and sports. Stories, current issues of public controversy produced outside of CBC News. Comments that appear on our website, scheduling, advertising. Yep. No, I think everyone here. This will be in the description box below after this live stream. And just a little bit of fun. The CBC PitchBot is on Twitter, and they've been there for a long, long time because, like I said, a lot of people have seen the ridiculousness in the CBC, and sometimes they do this thing where they send out a tweet and it's supposed to be satire, and this is CBC PitchBot on May 8th saying Canada says they will materially oppose Israel's Rafah invasion by sending a strongly worded letter with the next arms shipment to Israeli army. And they quote tweeted that with this from May 17th. Israel must comply with international law in Gaza and address the devastating humanitarian crisis there, a group of Western nations wrote in a letter to the Israeli government seen by Reuters on Friday. All countries belonging to the G7, apart from the US, signed the letter. The CBC PitchBot has run into this problem where they are trying to be satire. They are trying to joke only for it to be prophetic. It's like, no, we did that as a joke, not as, a suggestion. And just another one from them, from the CBC PitchBot. Yes, we've systemically silenced Palestinian voices in our newsrooms, killed stories, and have blacklist of prominent Palestinians we deem too accurate to air on TV. But have you considered that many Zionists have called us to whine about our coverage? That is it for that story. Yeah. Very important, though, I think, for more people to learn to take a critical look at mainstream media, the information we're getting, and then, just to think back and understand that there might be other stories that you will one day learn the truth about that at first you might be reluctant to believe because it sounds so shocking or it seems so out of place or you never heard of it before. But understand that it's probably always been like that, but you've just never been given the accurate portrayal, the accurate history, the accurate of both sides of what was happening. You've only ever heard one biased side of a story. And this is where a lot of Canadians kind of get tripped up when they start learning about the history of this country. Because all their lives they were taught this maple washed version of this country, and they have pride in that maple washed version of this country. And it actually becomes part of their identity. And so when they start learning about the history, the actual history of this country, they have an identity crisis. And a lot of people don't want to deal with that. They don't want to confront that. So it's much easier to, refuse to acknowledge the reality, to just say the other side is lying, that this is all made up, that this just came out of the blue, this wasn't here before. It's always been there. We just haven't been seeing that side of the story before. Because Canada has a very bloody history, and it continues to this day. And I would hazard to guess most Canadians don't know the country they're living in. They don't know what's really going on in a lot of instances. Job foreign journalists is also so important because Israel is delaying local journalists from reporting until after Western media, knowing most support Israel. Well, another thing, I probably should have mentioned this during, while I was reading the article, is that another thing that's scaring off a lot of people from covering this, especially, on the ground and going and doing fact finding, is how much Israel is targeting journalists. Like if you're a journalist in Gaza, in Israel, that's covering, what's happening honestly, your life is in danger. Not just your life, but your family's life. Because Israel has targeted journalists and their families. More journalists have been killed in this conflict than all the others in the past 20 years combined or something Like, it is an obscene number like that. Also, war crime. Just like when mainstream media is afraid to send in journalists to the Gaza Strip, but then still cater to the sensibilities of Zionists. It's like we're going to speak good of you, even though you would kill us if we were on the ground in Gaza covering it accurately. But we're still going to lick your boot.